Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here, and thank you, Mixer, for having us. So we're going to talk about war from different European perspectives. So as Jakob presenting already all of the speakers, I'm just going to present you very briefly Sphera network, which is the first network of independent media in Europe that actually produces social media tailored content and focuses on cross-border stories, and which is a partner of today's event. So now I'm going to start with just a very general question. How is the Ukrainian war is seen in your respective countries? Because I think that you can say that there's a feeling, the general feeling towards this war is very different according to the population and the country. And do you think that people actually understood that the Ukrainian war actually started back in 2014 and brought to the next level in 2022? I don't know who wants to start.
Okay, I can start. Of course, there are so many already said about Polish media and the work of them. So I would just like to say that we have pretty easy task in this situation, because there is nobody who we should to convince about who is the victim. Oh, thank you very much. No. Thank you. Who is the victim? Who is aggressor in this war? So it was pretty clear situation for the Polish people. We just need to bring them good content from the Ukraine, because this was also the problem, I think, which Polish media has realized. Just we don't have pretty strong ties with the Ukraine. So we don't have commentators, we don't have such a good context with Ukrainian journalists. But I think our media has learned further very fast and extremely actually fast, start to make 24-hour broadcasts or start with the pages, sites, web pages with the Ukrainian, in the Ukrainian language news, which was very important for the refugees, for the thousands of refugees which came to the Poland. But as a journalist, as a correspondent, I would also say that I see another side of the situation, which is not good, in my opinion, because after a few months, when the first emotions becomes a little bit more calm, and people start to search for some very good quality content, which make them understand the real situation in Ukraine, it becomes pretty clear that only our public media in Poland has permanent correspondents in Ukraine. Any other any other newspapers, even most richest televisions, did not send correspondents for permanent presence in Ukraine. And I think it was a huge mistake. Of course, there was a lot of issues about security, about budgets, also some kind of things inside the redactions. So, but after all, it put us in the situation where after a few months, this attention for the Ukrainian words becomes smaller and smaller, because most of the information that you can find in Polish media, they come from the second hand, let's say it this way, from the Ukrainian journalists or mainly from the West media. So this was a good side for one hand, but for the other hand, we didn't shape our audience for the good quality content.
Okay, and what's about the Spanish perspective?
Yeah, so I'm going to tell a bit before about my newspaper, so it's easier to understand the context. I'm coming from El Confidencial, that is native online newspaper, okay? But so we don't have a paper version that will be like the usual in Spain for the big media, but we are one of the biggest media now in Spain, like the 5th overall after El País, El Mundo, and so on. So this is interesting because this newspaper was mainly focusing only on national and economical issues. So when I arrived to the newspaper like 4 years ago almost, the international team was only 2 people. So that's an example on how for a Spanish audience, it's not really into international news. So they don't read international news that much. Of course, El País has this international idea, but it's more focused to Latin America. So it is weird for the Spanish audience to really think in this international idea. But still, when when the Russian started a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the records broke. I mean, it was incredible. The people was so interested. But I completely understand because it's difficult to find another example of history being made so close to home. Because, of course, it's in the gates of Europe. It's Russia invading a country, and it was these previous months talking nonstop about this happening or not, like a war foretold. But so we broke all records, and then it's when we started thinking how we should cover this war. As a very small international team, now we are 4 people, but still it is difficult. So let's send somebody how to cover it like in a more comprehensive way for our readers, because in Spain. Maybe for our audience, it's not important that much like the last minute, but more the angle or the story, what to tell them. But still, as I was telling you, it was very like the people was very interested on it, and also something you were talking about, 2014. The atmosphere has changed totally, because in 2014, that I was indeed covering Ukraine at that moment. The narratives were so different because if you know a bit of a Spanish context, we also have some independent movements within our country, in Catalonia and Euskadi, País Vasco. So there was kind of this idea of, maybe they are fighting for their independence. So this idea of this Russia narrative, it was kind of sold to parts of the Spanish public, especially in the left wing. They are kind of close to these narratives, or we are fighting because we are not receiving the same rights from the central government and so on. But in in 2022, with the invasion, it changed totally. So the Spanish public really was pro-Ukrainian. Like in a general way, it was very difficult to find any pro-Russian within the public. I was surprised because I wasn't expecting, because I had this experience from 2014, and it is also some Spanish context to understand this is because maybe in France or maybe in Poland, for example. The right wing, in Poland, no, in France and Italy, the right wing have these Russia links, but in Spain not, because of our story with Franco and hating communism and everything. And the left is not that much pro-Putin, but more anti-NATO. So it was like this mix that helped the Ukrainian cause really grow within the Spanish public. But of course, I mean, there is almost, I think, 9 months already, so the interest is so different, because for us it's not as close as Poland. I mean, for Poland it's something of security for them, for the country. In Spain it's not the case. In Spain we have other security issues, different. But still, I was surprised. And it's still one of the most read stories in El Confidencial, so we keep publishing at least one big story of one big article per day, and they are still the most read in the newspaper. So there's still some interest, but of course, just like as a normal global news cycle.
Okay. And Ellen, I know that you have made some researches about the audience, how the German audience answers to the war in Ukraine.
Yeah, hi, I'm Ellen. I'm the founder and CEO of the Bonn Institute. It's a new NGO in Germany, and we're working with larger media companies, also smaller ones, to transform journalism and to make it more user-centered, what could also say more human-friendly. And shortly after the February events, we saw that the Reuters Digital News Report was being published, and we noticed, as probably most of you, that news avoidance was again on the rise. And the Reuters people did another research in April, and the situation worsened. And that was when we decided to do a research, a study, to understand what the Reuters report didn't provide, so more insight about why do German audiences avoid the news on the war. And if there is time, I would like to show some findings. So the study is going to be published in about, well, hopefully 10 days' time or so, also in English on our website. And I've got some slides, if that's okay.
Of course.
Yeah, sure, okay. So that's the backdrop. So that's what we are seeing in the Reuters report. So Germany is the orange lines, and we see that there is declining trust, declining interest in news, and at the same time, rising news avoidance. And the situation has really become worse during the course of the war. So we wanted to know, how do Germans perceive news in times of war? Why do they actually tune out, and what would they want to have instead? We did a study with in-depth interviews, so not a quantitative study as the Reuters report, but a qualitative one, because we wanted to have a very diverse sample of people, including ones who might have, had to flee the war themselves at some point because they were very old or new to the country, people from all age groups and also from everywhere in Germany, to get like really deep insight in what's like moving them. So, and these are like the top results we got. We found that many people are really lacking representation in the news. So especially people from Eastern Germany do state that their views on the war do differ from the reports in the established media outlets very much. And this is not just the case with elderly Eastern Germans, but also with young students who say that their perception about what's going on in Ukraine is not being reflected properly in the German media. I'm not commenting on our findings, I'm just stating them, okay? So another thing is that Germans would like to get more personal stories from Ukraine. So they get a lot of war reports from the front lines. They get a lot of information about atrocities and what's going on. So we do have a lot of correspondence on the ground from public broadcasting as well as from private media, and I guess some of them are also here. I think they are really doing a great job, but at the same time, the users say we want more personal stories. We want to know much more about how regular Ukrainians are actually coping with the situation. That means we'd also like to have more information about people not only being victims, but also being very strong and active, and how they get organized, and how they are, fighting for survival, and how they are fighting behind the front lines. So people would also like to get more information about what is being done to solve this war. I know, after having been here for two days, I know that there is no such solution in sight. I'm just reporting that, what our sample did really say, like almost everyone, was we need to see some hope from time to time, because otherwise it's sometimes getting too much. I think we as media people do really need to understand that there is such thing as news avoidance, and that situations like wars, climate crisis, pandemics, and plus having to deal with regular lives everywhere is sometimes a bit overwhelming for people, and that they really tend to tune out. And I think it's really important that we find ways to keep people informed, to keep them engaged with the news, because it's so important that people get all the information they need on what's going on. And it's not that they are not interested. Everyone we've interviewed said we are actually interested. But it doesn't mean that they are getting informed all the time. So some are just getting informed once a week. Another last point maybe is the use of language and pictures, which I found very interesting because the group we interviewed was very much divided about the use of pictures. So half of the group said we want to have trigger warnings because we want to decide actively what we want to see and what we want to protect ourselves from. Others said, no, it's really, really important that we see the whole truth and there is no need to have trigger warnings at all. We also spoke to journalists because we wanted to understand, do they know about these user needs? So we interviewed journalists from many media outlets in Germany, and what they said is they pretty much aware of what people want. It's just that our newsrooms and our culture in the newsroom is not, adapt to help them report in such a way very often. So reporting about solutions, for instance, is often mocked by superiors as sugarcoating or good news. So people sometimes don't really dare to come up with, pitches to do stories about potential solutions or people, being kind of positive or brave or, getting organized. Another thing is journalistic self-perception, that there's still this self-perception of journalists having to be very, very tough. So we've heard during these past 2 days a lot about mental health issues, and that's something that journalists do face. But there are studies from the field of psychology that show that people who are consuming video content of atrocities do get even higher stress levels than the ones who are actually being on the ground. I found that really surprising. I didn't know that, and I guess almost no journalist knows that. But it does have a huge impact on our audiences. So I think we should really start to think about the impact our reporting has on the people. And the last thing, as I mentioned before, is people in the audience don't feel represented, always represented, so they think there should be a much larger diversity of perspectives in reporting. And the journalist says, yeah, we do understand, but most newsrooms are very non-diverse. So it's really an obstacle for a diversity in reporting when you don't have a diversity bunch of reporters. That's pretty obvious. So that was my last remarks, and I hope you found it insightful.
I'm going to bounce back on what you said about positive news. How do you cover the war in those times? What's important to show? Are there any information that you avoid? And especially, are you looking for some help from Ukrainian journalists and medias? Do you find it useful, or even do you feel that's the urge to be helped by people on the ground directly? Because, as you mentioned before, second-hand information, it's a shame to have only second-hand information to cover such a big war that's happening in our continent.
Yeah, that's true, but maybe I will start with your first question. What is the most important topics? I would say that I'm in a very specific situation. I'm not a news journalist. I'm working for the magazine, so we making bigger stories, more deeper stories. And also, I'm half Ukrainian and half Polish. I know the languages, both of the countries. So for me, it was pretty obvious that my task just to cover, to show stories, how actually war impact just normal Ukrainians, just civils. So
it's more people-focused.
Pardon?
It's more people-focused stories on people. And
yes,
not
yes, definitely focused on people, on their stories, about what they come through. So of course there are. It's very tough because it's extremely tough to find some kind of positive stories there. Of course they are, because sometimes people find their loved ones which they think already they are dead, or even sometimes they find them in prison in Russia. They already very happy because they are alive. There is a chance that someday they come back home. So, but I mean, for me, it was most important thing to focusing and showing the just normal people stories. And of course, I also have some experience in Ukrainian media years ago, but I still have my friends in Ukraine, journalists. They were helping very much. Very much. They were totally open in sharing the context, helping to find the heroes for the text. So this cooperation, I think, it's really great.
And do you decide to maybe show stories that gives hope, or you prefer to show like the brutality of what's happening over there?
I think it's the second point. It's really the second point because. I mean, there was a huge number of this kind of positivity stories in social media, and they were actually very exposed in Polish media. So if I can really, with my language skills, can talk and understand true situation, for example, the prisoners of war which just come back home, or people who standing in the graves of their loved ones, and now is going in the exhumation like it was in Bucha. We can tell these stories. I can understand it, and I can write it in this way where Polish audience also can feel it and understand this.
And Alicia, what about you?
Yeah, so I find it's very different from what you were saying, because, for example, maybe it's because of the Spanish audience is farther from the Ukrainian population and everything, but somehow I felt that the human stories, it's sometimes difficult to sell to our readers, because they say, okay, another sad story. So you try, it's like it became a race who is telling the worst story to really shock the public, and then they read the story. So I don't want to get into that, no, because every story has their own tragedy, no, even if it's not the worst case scenario, but still it's tragedy. So to try to sell these human stories that are so important for journalism, so it can't be understood, journalism, without these human stories. What we try to do is to code it, like to start. I can't remember who was saying that you need to start with something small to tell something bigger. So we use these human stories to explain something to the reader, like to say, yes, you are going to read about this woman who was trapped for, 30 days in a basement in Jahidne, just to understand the scale of the Russian occupation in Chernihiv. No? So trying to say, yeah, okay, so it's human, but it's also strategic. It's also geopolitical. It's also energy, for example. So our readers are very into these stories that try to explain a bit more, like the whole situation. So that's why, for example, also our coverage was so different than other media in somehow the person that is in the ground, that is only one person, we rotate, but it's only one person, we don't send that many. And it's like the point of the Sphera, but really what is finally published is so a choral work, because we do it with infographics, we do it with video, we do it with, analysis of scene, a lot of things to really try to make this so choral, so not really breaking news, because you can do that with breaking news, but you do it with, data, for example. No, I remember one of my most read stories was explaining the Ukrainian invasion to a Spanish scale. So I was comparing, for example, with some maps of the destruction of Mariupol, how much that will be on Spanish cities. Or, for example, with some... Of course, you use what you learned on the ground, and you use what you can't know what to write without you being there on the ground, but still it needs to take a step back to say, okay, so the Spanish audience needs something different, because it's another story of a Ukrainian refugee they are not going to read it. So and it's sad, but it's how you try to trick them to read this, to keep reading about the war.
Yeah, of course. And I know that you're going to Kiev very soon, actually. Do you collaborate with journalists on the ground or activists maybe from NGOs?
One thing that I found very interesting covering Ukraine, and so different from the other conflicts that I've been working on, I started working in Nairobi for my career in Africa, in Kenya, and later I was in Cairo based for 3 years. But in Ukraine, you felt like the people really want to tell the stories. Somehow in Egypt, when I was there, it was 2017, so, 15, so it was already past the Arab Spring, it has already passed the al-Sisi, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi coup d'etat. So it was this kind of depression, not really trying to tell the story, so like why I should tell you again my story if nothing is going to change. But in Ukraine, you felt this idea of the people want to tell your stories, want to help, want to be so super as active as they can, because it's like a national duty to really do something. And you felt that, and as a journalist, that it's incredible for your job, because everyone wants to talk to you. Everyone had to say, yeah, I have this story, and see why you don't talk about this. It's a lot of things happening, and the people want to share. So, yes, I talk with Ukrainian journalists, but in this kind of sharing atmosphere, and NGOs, of course, also. It's not only them, of course, but they are a part of, very important also, of the job in the field.
According to you, what's the best way to cover the war? In what format do you use? What format spoke the most to your audience? Alicia, you mentioned infographics, for example. Do you prefer, I don't know, long descriptive written articles, or maybe images are more brutal? So what do you choose to show to your audience, and what you prefer to avoid? Maybe images are too brutal, so what's your approach on this?
It's also specific of our team, because, as my colleague previously said, we work mainly in Ukraine in a 3-person team. Another journalist, Patrick Michalski, and also very talented photographer, Maciej Stanik. He did amazing job with the photos. So our reportages from the Ukraine is always like 3 authors of it. The photos is main part of this text sometimes. It's because it's showing sometimes even more than text. Of course, we're writing a big reportage which shows every part of this situation and explain it. But without this photo, it wouldn't be so. People would not feel it so deeply with these photos. So, and if you're asking about the photos of for example, with the brutal images, I would say, as our actually photographer Maciej Stanik says always, it's always a kind of morality choice to publish, to make a photo of the corpse, for example, or not. So I would say this way, in my opinion, we can publish it, and we should publish it to show brutality of war, but there has to be some story behind it. It's not only to shock the published opinion, but show there is a person there. That person really did have a story before Russians came and killed this person. And in this case, yes, I think we should publish the photos like with the very brutal images.
Yeah, I totally agree with Tetiana. What she said, it's not for the shock, it's not for just the gruesome or the blood. It's, if it has a story or it has a reason, yes, I agree, we should publish. It's my opinion. Sometimes the newspaper doesn't feel that's the same, but yeah, it's choosing.
Yeah. So I think we're out of time now. I don't know if there's any question in the audience. It seems
Then
like no.
I'm always have the questions.
Go ahead.
I'm actually have the question for Alicia. You mentioned that Spanish media, if they are internationally oriented, they think about Latin America. And well, I know that Latin America has very specific attitude to the war in Ukraine. Like they are not obviously supporting Ukraine. They're thinking that the situation is obscure and stuff like this. So, do you think that this attitude of Latin America influenced somehow the coverage of war in Ukraine in Spain?
No, I don't see that much the link. But as what she was saying, it's true. I mean, in Latin America, I have some friends in Peru. We met after I came back first time from Ukraine, and I was shocked how far these narratives, because it's not like they look Russia TV or something like that. But still, there is this narrative of, well, maybe it was somehow both sides' fault. So I was really shocked how far that narrative get. But how this affects Spanish coverage, I don't think it's going that way. It's more the opposite. No, for example, Confidencial doesn't have that, but El País has this Latin America bureaus and everything. But it's more Spain going to Latin America and not that much Latin American to Spain in that kind of flow of information. But still, yes, there are some topics that are more interested to the Latin American audience, and they cover more, like, of course, grain and crisis, inflation, and that kind of things.
Thank you. Anyone else? Okay, I think we can thank you for this wonderful and very interesting conversation.
Thank you.